rejected vehemently this whole Al-Qaeda notion from day one, and rejected violence altogether as an instrument to achieve their political goals. So I'll conclude simply by reiterating what Robbie said is, from my perspective, we need a lot more history. Right? We need to find ways to help our students at whatever level they are understand the role of the United States in this region, not simply see us as over here victims, right? Although, of course, thousands of people, completely innocent people, were victimized on September 11th, but understand where this comes from in its broader historical sweep. And that means some attention to the ways in which American actions and a very active American presence going back many decades has been perceived and received and often resented by people in this part of the world. There are analogs in other parts of the world, but of course we're most interested in the Middle East and the broader Muslim world, which the events of 9/11 come most directly out of. Doing this, of course, is extremely difficult. I don't envy your task. I don't think I always succeed in doing this with my undergraduate students, who are some years older than the students you deal with. They too find this a revelation. Again, 9/11 at this point is ancient history. Vietnam might have been the ancient Greeks as far as they know. So it's always a struggle wherever it happens. But I'd like to think it can be done, and we can find creative ways to use the great range of resources that are out there in many different forms to try to help people understand this. And along the way, or in the process, sharpen their critical thinking skills and their sense of themselves and these events of the world they live in history, to make sense of themselves as actors, as people who are living in and through history, which I think is ultimately essential if they're to be serious and responsible citizens. So I'll stop there. Thank you.
Leslie, I know you spoke at the beginning. I don't know if you have anything that you want to add.
Just a couple of things. I'm very struck by the phrase you used about historical amnesia in America. It's very, very striking for a European, that tendency, as in what the ever-to-be-quoted Donald Rumsfeld calls old Europe. We are perhaps to a fault imprisoned by historical considerations. I've done quite a few things in Bosnia and Serbia where within 30 seconds of any conversation you're in 1396 and the victimization of the Serb people over all of those centuries and how all other things are seen through that lens. That can be as debilitating as an amnesia. And it is intriguing what you say about this inward-looking obsession here. I remember being shocked by a British journalist friend, a very bleeding journalist, from a slightly left-of-centre perspective, who simply said on September the 12th, America had it coming to them. That is a view which is perhaps appallingly more widely felt in the outside world than most people here fully understand. It's not one I share in those brutal terms in any way at all, but it is even amongst thoughtful people where these issues of, as you say, Chile, the destabilization of regimes from Mossadegh onwards. I did a film about the American hostages in Iran. That was an extremely insightful thing to work on. And the fact that many of those hostages were in fact passionate pro-Iranian and Farsi-speaking former academics meant that they had an agonizing awareness of exactly the reasons why the students had acted in the way that they did. But I'm sure that it's tremendously important what you're both talking about in terms of finding a way to bring to the attention of students this wider perspective. It's tremendously important, and sensitively, given the appalling things that happened here, sensitively to make it plain that understanding is not justification. They're very, very different activities, and I think your parallel about teaching Nazi history is a very good one, actually. That could help people to understand that in telling people the fairly wretched things that have been done in America's name over the last, well, certainly the last 50 or maybe 100 years is a valuable thing to do. I'm still passionately pro-American, so I tangle with these things.
So unless there are further comments from the panel, we can begin to take questions from the audience. Yes, go ahead.
I would like to just warn everyone that the preparation has to be done before you delve into this, because through a personal shock, I was out visiting the Japanese memorial to the ship that they had, the Arizona, and took the flowers and threw the wreath in and watched the ritual and everything. Then I went inside to listen to the American-made movie that went with it. And the man said a little bit of history might help, and he talked about the war and economic things. And as a result, the Japanese had their backs to the wall, and therefore they had to do what they did. And I was so shocked I got up and ran out, because I'm an American. It's something that I'm commemorating out of my feeling towards these soldiers who hadn't done anything to anyone, and we were there stationed, and they were being the most offensive. And yet, here's an American-made movie as part of our whatever, done through Japanese influence, telling us that the Japanese had no other choice but to bomb the Arizona. And I've never gotten, one of the small traumas in my life that I've never gotten over. And so I think if you're going to start presenting that other side of the book, to kids, since we do grow up in this very, as in most countries, slanted history, we need to prepare them for things that everybody was doing.
I agree. I think that you need to, I think also I would say that this 9/11 analysis wouldn't be the first thing you dealt with in the semester. No. Hopefully you'd have already developed that sort of habit of mind and showing how, you could think about it, if you're doing U.S. history, about the U.S. relation to Native Americans. That there is a, if you look at American history from the perspective of Native Americans, it looks like, centuries of tragedy. Rather than, if you look at it from the white European perspective, it's the rise of freedom, right? So I think that if you look at other aspects of American history where there are contending views of this role, then I think by the time you got to something that's so much more sensitive, then I think they'd be in a better place to deal with. But I agree with you. I think it's very difficult, which is what I was trying to say at the beginning, that having been, and I would say, I think Zach alluded to, I was in New York too. I saw the first tower fall, and it's hard. I think it's very difficult for anybody, sort of, you're almost like you're swimming against, you're sailing against these very strong winds that say, sort of comfortable assumptions about the world. But I think that from my perspective, if you think about history as a critical discipline and as a way of knowing the world and understanding where you are, and it's really essential. And I guess I'd also say, I think it's very dangerous to bring up a generation of students who don't understand that. Like, I think that the image that always comes to my mind is the Bay of Pigs. When the United States, the CIA and all the intelligence folks, in a kind of act of wishful thinking, convinced President Kennedy that, that this would be, just you snap your fingers and again, a few troops, the Cuban people would rise up against Castro, because we loathed him. but really not understanding how Cubans were going to react. And so in other words, a mistake, it's a little bit like medical malpractice or something. If you don't learn what you need to do to operate successfully, someone could get killed. And I think it's the same thing.
Can I ask, do you think this historical amnesia, how, I'm quite old enough to remember being here in the 60s when a whole generation was obsessed with the notion that America was the world's demon. I mean, that's what their banners were unfurled about the enormity of American conduct around the world. Abby Hoffman and Jerry Rubin majored in this stuff, and millions of students went with them. How did that lose its hold on the imagination?
Well, I think the country just moves to the right. It's been moving to the right since then. And I mean, the things that you see in American politics today, almost unimaginable. If you look at where we are. So I think that since Reagan, even since Nixon, since the end of the 60s, there's been a backlash against almost anything having to do with the 60s. So I think that the students today come up in a very different world. And actually, one way of thinking about this, there's a wonderful film, a documentary film called Letter to the Next Generation, that I use with my students. It's a documentary about Kent State students in the Reagan era, looking back on Kent State in 1970. And it's made by sort of a 60s filmmaker who can't understand initially why these students are so conservative. And they don't want to hear about Kent State 1970 anymore. They're really fed up with it. And they feel like the students were responsible to some degree in provoking the guard. But what happens is that, he figured out that the students, even the very apolitical students, knew how many days the hostages had been held in Iran. They felt the United States was not a perpetrator of imperialism or something, but was a victim of these unreasoning, darker people, and that they're all attacking us, who hated freedom and our way of life and were jealous of us. So that had been a kind of, and also the image of America, we're back, that Reagan had getting over Vietnam syndrome. I think that's been very effective. So what we're talking about now is, a very much a minority perspective. Although I would say that, there is some research that say students of color, African American students in particular, start out with a much more critical take on these things. That hasn't been lost because that's transmitted sort of through family, sort of generationally. But overall, I think that mindset has been really transformed.
Yeah, but plainly.
Yeah, go ahead.
Would you say, adding on, that historians, for their part, might have been guilty as well of this? But yes, it's attributable to a shift to the right. But the revisionist historians might be said to have overplayed their hand. They offered a mirror image of the oversimplified American narrative, so to that of celebratory history, for instance. So in sort of leaving us with the paucity of, nuance, I think the revisionist historians left many liberals even feeling, this can't be all it is. You can't go from celebrating everything that the United States has done to completely denigrating it, and there's nothing nuanced about this. So would you say that revisionist historians themselves played a role in this shift?
Well, I think there's all kinds of revisionist historiography. I don't think there's, you might say to some degree the first wave, but I think there's been lots of waves. I couldn't think of, if you think about Cold War historiography or the historiography of Vietnam, I think it's much more multi-layered than that. I mean, I think that, and also you're assuming that people read revisionist history.
Well, our students do. I mean, we feel an obligation to show it to them, but I'm always torn, even in using Zinn, for instance. It just feels a little bit, again, not rich enough.
Right, but I was saying Zinn is really not, I mean, if you look at, Zinn himself has been sort of criticized by left historians like Michael Kazin. It's a very hegemonic view of things, and it's not really what I would say the most sophisticated, even though it's very popular, revisionist historiography. I think if you look at it, it depends on, it's a huge topic. That is, which kind of revisionism are we talking about? I don't think that, a sophisticated revisionism would be doing what say Zinn was doing. So I think it's there. I'm not saying that you're saying is wrong.
No,
I just think that there's different form. In other words, it's possible to be very critical, say, of the war in Vietnam without demonizing the United States. And there are ways to do that. And I think good histories manage to do both. Yeah. Go ahead.
So this term historical amnesia has been referenced a few times, and it's a phrase that I use a lot myself. But what I've sort of come to notice with students is not what I would always call historical amnesia, but more selective memory. And that I don't think actually Americans are completely forgotten the past. They've just constructed such their particular narratives of it that it's sometimes, it may be even harder than sort of the blank slate, that they're so wedded to a particular vision of the past. And I was wondering sort of how you see that fitting into this.
Yeah, well, I used the phrase the first time, so I'll say I agree with you. I mean, I think that's a more useful way to think about it. It's not a blank slate, you're right, because something's in there, of course. There's a story, and I think, part of our job, and I know this when I'm teaching about the Middle East or the Muslim world, but I think it's true of everything. You're not starting from a blank slate. So the first task is to help people, understand where what's already in their heads comes from, and try to think about that critically, and try to see then that there are other pieces to this story, that it's a more complicated, messy, wider story that goes back a lot further, and you need to broaden that kind of thinking. So, it is, I think that's true, and there's certain things stand out, certain landmarks, certain events, right? September 11th construed in certain ways in people's heads, right? So then you have to start from that point. I would, just in my defense, say maybe more broadly, and in relation to what Leslie said, we as a society, again, it's a gross generalization, but tend to have much less of a sense of history. There may be good sides to that, right?
Yeah, there are.
We're not worried about what the Ottomans did to the Serbs in 1386.
In some ways, it's tremendously releasing.
Yeah, it can be. It can be.
But it gives a bounce to American look at
absolutely.
themselves, which we don't have in old Europe.
Right. But it also means that you then set it up so that you can make the same mistakes over and over again.
That's right.
Right? And that's the downside. So they may not be as horrific as September 11th, but I encourage my students to think every American administration, really going back quite a few, so many decades, has foundered on the Middle East, has run into this wall with unhappy results on both ends with regard to the Middle East or the Muslim world. Whether it's Iran or Afghanistan or Iraq or whatever. And how do we understand that? Why this place? Why not Latin America? Why not other kinds of places? Right? So this is a part of the world in which the United States has been deeply entangled and often very painfully. We then need to make sense of this and figure out where these things come from, and again put it in a historical context. So this isn't true of the next 5 administrations.
I was intrigued by the question about, we can teach about Nazism, but we can't teach about 9/11. We can write endless number of books about Hitler, and we're not accused of excusing his crimes, but we have trouble reading the writings of bin Laden because we're seeming to condone Islamofascism. Is that really true? I mean, why is it that we are able to write endlessly, read endlessly about Nazism, and not feel anything except sort of better about it? That we've examined, we've looked into the devil's lair, we've looked down the maw of evil. Are they really the same?
Well, I tried to be a little cautious about this and say they're not analogies here. But I think the key difference is perhaps that when you talk about the Nazis in American society, we all agree, evil, right, bad. So let's try to understand where that came from. This kind of stuff is very much about us, right? I mean, it was an attack on us on September 11th. And if once you start getting into it, you get into this complicated story that is also about what people on the receiving end of American power, or some people on the receiving end of American power, choose to do about that. So then it raises all sorts of questions about our role in the world. Again, one can come to different conclusions, analyze it in very different ways, but it immediately is about us. And who likes to think of themselves as possibly even being perceived as doing things that are problematic, right? That have had unhappy results. I mean, we certainly don't. And again, given that the United States, you know, the way our society and culture works, and we see ourselves, even though we're deeply integrated with the rest of the world in all sorts of ways, we tend to see ourselves as in a box. So trying to open up that box and see the ways in which for a very long period of time, I mean, probably going back to day one, but with regard to the Middle East, going back now, you know, 60 or so years, the United States has been deeply involved in the politics, and some of what comes out of that is at least in part because of choices we've made in the past. And that's a tough thing for people to do because it challenges our notions about we're doing good in the world, we're a beacon of light in the world. You know, we may be in certain ways, but of course not everybody sees it that way. And then we need to understand why certain people don't see it that way. That's a touchy thing. At least that'd be my first response to your question.
I'm struck by the analogy with the way that Britons looked at Britain up to and after the First World War as being somewhat analogous. I mean, we were the Redeemer nation. Nothing awful had ever happened under British control. There was an enormous jingoism and sense of self-worth and self-satisfaction, which didn't begin to get challenged until, you know, way into the century. Now, of course, we've come full circle, and many of my fellow citizens can't think of a single redeeming feature. I mean, not one. They're just laceratingly self-critical. And it's fascinating being here to find that the most thoughtful people still feel more positive about America than anybody I know feels about their country. There is, and it's, you know, I share this to somebody. This notion, which is, as I understand it historically, is actually a religious one of the Redeemer nation, the shining city standing on a hill, the exceptional planet redeeming place, which I guess we felt certainly up to the First World War in Britain. My God, did we surrender it and lose it? And I wonder with what ambiguous consequences.
But there too, if I can just follow up briefly. So there, I mean, one of the other things we all need to do, I think, constantly is disaggregate who the us is.
Yeah.
So it's not good America or bad America. That doesn't get us very far, right? No society is good or bad, or no culture is good or bad. But we can help our students try to understand why in 1953 President Eisenhower had the CIA overthrow Mossadegh.
Yeah.
Now, not everybody in the United States liked that decision necessarily, right? Or knew, I mean, in fact, most Americans did not know about it. Iranians seem to have all figured it out pretty quickly and they never forgot, right? But it came as a revelation decades later to many Americans. So that's not about the United States as a society, as a culture, good and bad. Or the decision in the Reagan administration, right? The Reagan administration backed Saddam Hussein in his vicious war of aggression against Iran and actually intervened militarily to enable the Iraqis to fight the Iranians to a stalemate, right? And covered up their use of poison gas against their own people, not just against the Iranians, and on and on. So this is not a defense of the Iranian revolutionary regime or the Ayatollah Khomeini. And of course, you know, they had certain strategic reasons for doing this. But we also know that throughout this period, there were lots of people, right, in government, outside of government, who said this is a really bad idea. There will be a price to be paid for this. It's morally wrong, but it's also strategically stupid. So there are arguments about this. So it's sort of giving some sense that in any society, people are always fighting and arguing about these things, their disagreements. It's not something that stems from some essence of America. It's part of the ongoing arguments, debates, conversations that we're always having about who we are, what should we be doing, and of course about our past, right? About those Confederate battle flags over the South Carolina Capitol, right? Which some people think is a lovely thing and other people think is horrific. We continue to have these conversations. Here we are on the 150th anniversary of the Emancipation Proclamation being issued, right? Still a hot issue.
Yeah.
Sorry, yeah.
Yeah, I wanted to have some of your insights on American textbooks and that we're, you know, where the war on terror is in American textbooks as sort of an event, an ongoing event, and how we sort of bring that back to the war on terror as really a form of rhetoric that was used first by Reagan, but essentially in the George Bush 2001 speech, where he clearly says who attacked us. Al-Qaeda attacked us. I mean, that's even in his original acknowledgement. But then he takes that into, and they're in 60 countries, and they're being harbored throughout the world. And, you know, then it becomes this sort of global war on terror, which is not an enemy, but a tactic, an idea. I don't know. So what, as teachers, you know, when you have a textbook that's talking about the war on terror, how do you kind of deconstruct that? How do we fight any representation of what's been happening since 2001 in terms of the rhetoric of it? Is that clear? You know,
Yeah.
Well, I think one of the issues is what is terrorism, too. I mean, how do you define, you know, how do you define what terrorism is?
Right.
I mean, Bin Laden, when he was alive with us against the Soviets in Afghanistan, was a freedom fighter, right?
Yeah.
So, you know, I think that's part of the conversation too. You know, how do you define?
Well, I'm just saying that a kind of rhetorical, the use of rhetoric has become in textbooks.
Accepted as a category.
Right. Well, I would.
Just-
go ahead.
But there, I mean, what's striking is the Obama administration dropped the term.
Yeah.
Right? So that gives us a very interesting opening. Why does the Obama administration say, sorry, we don't use that term anymore? Right? There is no global war on terror. There is, you know, something else going on, a series of discrete struggles. There are connections among these groups, but, right? And maybe that's a way then to go back and look at, so what is framing things as a global war on terror and saying that's the category and it's fact. You know, what did that serve? What did that enable the Bush administration to do? How did it enable them to think about the world? Again, translating that into what happens in the classroom is, of course, a difficult thing.
It's difficult.
But just to show that these things, you know,
Yeah.
shift over time.
Right.
And again, you know, as Robbie said, that, you know, some of our allies have used terrorist means as well, right? So then we need to, you know, show that, and it's a strategy. It's not a abstract noun that one can fight a war against.
I would also add that I think just being able to deal with the whole issue of war more generally, and this has to be related to that as well, it is, why is the United States continually at war? I mean, we've been at war every year of the century. If you look at the course of American history, the years that we're at war have been increasing, and why is that? So I think that trying to understand, you know, put this in a larger context and thinking about, you know, what war is, and is war the norm in American history as opposed to exception, and what does that mean? I think it's really important to be able to sort that out. And I just think that just being able to step back and think about the terms that are used in the textbook is extremely important. That, you know, it's just a starting point. That why is it being framed that way? And by the way, also, how do wars begin? You know, what about this idea of a preemptive war? You know, I think how do wars begin? How do they end? What are they called? You know, like I think about one of my favorite is the Spanish-American War. You know, which a lot of it was fought in Cuba. Why isn't it called the Spanish-Cuban-American War? I mean, how is the war framed? Is a really important part of it. It's a political thing. So I think again, you know, being able to step back and try to point out the problematic nature of that. And as Zach said, you know, why is that term launched and why does it get dropped? I think they're really important.
I teach much younger children, and I actually know this person very well. We are always dealing with this problem of, do we use textbooks, or what version of the event are we going to give the kids? So the recourse I've resorted to is somewhat similar to your approach in the first documentary, if I understand it. I asked the students to go to original newspaper accounts of the historical event and find out what actually was said. And then if they can interview people who have memories of those things, we did that as well. But I'm dealing with kids who have not been historical amnesia. They were 2 years old when 9/11 happened. So this might as well be the Middle Ages too. It's not Vietnam. And I find that approach avoids the abstraction of trying to talk about terrorism, which, I mean, it rings no bells. They can read well enough to be able to understand a 20th century newspaper article. And in fact, coming to those things with nothing, very little historical context, can lead them to very interesting